Four Tet is one of the longest-standing currently active electronic producers, with the project's beginnings dating back to 1997. He has cemented himself among the likes of legendary IDM pioneers such as Aphex Twin, Squarepusher, and Boards of Canada. The Four Tet project was birthed at a time when music technology was rapidly evolving, and Four Tet was right at the forefront of the evolution, using the technology to craft music with methods that were relatively unexplored at the time.
I taught you through everything and what it does. So I've got obviously one computer running Ableton, which has got the main bodies of the tracks. Each channel is a different song, basically. So there's this song of mine, Angel Echoes. So I usually take all the songs and break them up.
Taking this fresh approach allowed him to concoct his signature sound that was instantly recognizable, and he has been able to evolve that sound while still preserving its core essence for over 25 years. After various collaborations with Skrillex and Fred Again in recent years, the Four Tet project now has more eyes and ears on it than ever. To fully understand how the Four Tet project has become what it is today, let's take a trip back in time. Kieran Hebden, also known as Four Tet, was born in 1977 in Putney, a district of South London. His mother is of Indian descent but was born in South Africa, and his father is an Englishman who is a sociology lecturer. Kieran attended the famous Elliott School in Putney, which was teeming with soon-to-be world-famous musicians and actors. Seriously though, just take a look at this list of famous graduates from the school. During his time there, Kieran became friends with Adam Ilhan and Sam Jeffers, and the three of them would go on to form the band Fridge a year after graduation, which I'll go into more detail about later. While attending the Elliott School, Kieran, Adam, and Sam became good friends with fellow classmates Alexis Taylor and Joe Goddard, who would later go on to be founding members of the synth-pop band known as Hot Chip. Kieran also befriended William Bevan, who is now known as Burial. For those that don't know, Burial was one of the most influential players of the early London dubstep scene, and if you want to know more about that, I highly recommend watching Timba on Toast's documentary, All My Homies Hate Skrillex. Since his time at the Elliott School, Four Tet has done a fair amount of remix work for Hot Chip, and he's also done collaborations with Burial, which I'm going to talk about more later in the video. Four Tet, Hot Chip, and Burial aren't the only big artists to attend the Elliott School either. Romy Croft, Oliver Sim, Beria Karishi, and James Smith, who are all members of the XX, also attended the school about 10 years after Kieran, and Four Tet has also done remix work for them. Some other notable alumni include Peter Green, who is the founder of Fleetwood Mac, Herman Lee, who is a lead guitarist for Dragon Force, and Colin Peterson, who is a member of the Bee Gees. The list of famous alumni goes well beyond musicians, as it includes many actors and pro athletes as well. Clearly, the school fostered creativity very well. Joe Goddard of Hot Chip once said in an interview, "There was a spirit. If you wanted to do something, just go and fucking do it. You didn't need permission."
Our school, it has kind of an interesting load of musicians have come out of the school, like Kieran Hebden, Four Tet, and Burial, and the XX. I think that the school had a good ethos where it said kind of that you should try to go for whatever you want to do and try to do it. You know?
Kieran has also opened up about the nature of the school, saying, "I remember being allowed to rehearse with my band at lunch and for hours after school without any interference. When I was at school, drum and bass happened. Our teachers would let us set up big sound systems and have drum and bass parties during lunchtime breaks. We'd be in a drama room with machines and strobe lights for half an hour, dancing to DJ Zink's Super Sharp Shooter or something blasting out at a huge volume." After his time at the Elliott School, Kieran enrolled in Manchester University, where he earned a degree in math and computer studies. His time in college was when he teamed up with his former classmates to form the instrumental post-rock band called Fridge. Kieran played the guitar and was in charge of the samples, while Adam played bass and Sam Jeffers was on the drums. Their sound was rhythm-heavy, and it was inspired by krautrock bands such as Can and Mew. To be clear, krautrock is German for cosmic music, which was a broad genre of experimental rock that developed in West Germany in the late 60s and early 70s. Fridge was active from 1995 to 2001, and their sound evolved from post-rock towards electronic as Kieran became more interested in techno and drum and bass. They released their first album in 1997, and they followed it up with more albums in 1998, 99, and 2001. They did get back together in 2007 just to play 2 gigs, and they also released one last album that year. Although they haven't been active since, they've never officially split up. The last activity that we've seen from the band was in 2009 when they released a 21-track compilation of music that they had made from 1996 through 1998. While simultaneously attending college and being active in Fridge, Kieran launched his first solo project called 4T Recordings. His first release under the project was the single called Double Density, which came out in 1997, released on the Output record label. The second song he released was in 1998 with a track called Falcon's Maze, except this time he used the name Joshua Falcon. As you can probably already see, Kieran has used a handful of artist names over the span of his career, and there are many more that I'm going to cover throughout this video. I'm gonna throw in a quick disclaimer that I'm not gonna be covering every single piece of work that Kieran has ever made. His catalog of work is extremely extensive, as you would expect from an artist that has been around for nearly 3 decades. However, I will be covering all major releases, such as albums and EPs, as well as all side projects and any other releases that I see fitting. Kieran didn't start using the name Four Tet until 1998 when he released the single 3625. The name for the track was derived from its length, as it was 36 minutes and 25 seconds long. The following year in 1999, he released 2 EPs, Glasshead and Misnomer. In that same year, he also released his debut album called Dialogue, which fused jazz samples with hip-hop drums. Later in the year, Four Tet appeared on Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 with a remix of the opening track. The remix gave Kieran more exposure, as Aphex Twin was one of the leading IDM artists at the time. For those that aren't familiar with the term, IDM stands for Intelligent Dance Music. The term isn't used as much today, but it was used more commonly back then to describe artists such as Aphex Twin and Four Tet. IDM is about experimentation rather than specific genre constraints, and it was generally more laid back than the club-ready dance music. All of these releases came during a period of inactivity for Fridge, which allowed Kieran to fuel his solo project. He used some of that time to work with the German producer known as Pol, and together they released a 4-track joint EP in 2000. In 2001, Kieran signed with Domino Records and he dropped his sophomore Four Tet album, which was called Pause. It was a logical follow-up to his debut album Dialogue, as it carried similar arrangements of bright instrumentation, except this time around, there was more prominent usage of acoustic guitars. This led to the press labeling his sound as folktronica. It was basically a more nuanced version of something that you might hear in a modern lo-fi hip-hop playlist. The album gained him enough notoriety to play at 3 festivals in the UK and Belgium, as well as a one-off club show in London. 2001 was also the year that Kieran launched his own record label called Text Records, and Fridge released their Happiness album on the label that same year. Later in the year, Four Tet released his 3rd EP called No More Mosquitoes, which was followed by the Pause EP. He was also tapped for a handful of remixes that year, something that became a major part of his brand up to 2005. In 2002, more remixes followed, and he also released the single called I'm on Fire. He spent the majority of the year working on his next album, as well as supporting Radiohead on their international tour. Four Tet released the album called Rounds in 2003, which is widely considered to be his breakout album. Up to that point, he was arguably more well known for his work with Fridge, but after the release of Rounds, his solo profile as Four Tet soared. It caught the attention of high-profile artists like Jay Dilla and Tom York, ultimately putting the Four Tet project on the map. When asked about the album 10 years later, Kieran recalls vivid memories of his life during its creation. He said, "I just remember the time, living in a little apartment, and the people that I was hanging out with really vividly. A couple of relationships started and ended during that record. In the middle of making it, I toured opening for Radiohead in Spain and Portugal, and it made me rethink live electronic music when I hadn't thought about it much. So when I hear Rounds, it's like looking at an old diary." He made the album by incorporating the recording process into his day-to-day life. He said he's never been the type of person to spend 10 hours in the studio every day. Rather, he would break up his recording throughout the day. In his own words, "I'd get up in the morning and watch TV, make a little music, hang out with friends, go out to dinner, come back, and make a little music." Music was constantly happening. Kieran claims that Rounds is where he really found his sound. He said that his prior releases sounded like too much of a product of their influence. Rounds had its own sound that felt experimental yet human rather than compilations of things that came before it. The album gave Four Tet enough notoriety to go on a headline world tour the same year, playing shows in the US, Canada, UK, Ireland, and Japan. Between 2003 and 2004, a handful of Four Tet singles were released, as well as his EP, My Angel Rocks Back and Forth. That EP was a lot less beat-driven compared to his previous works. The songs were more like dreamy soundscapes rather than intentionally structured tracks. He also revealed a new alias of sorts in 2004 called 4TLR, which stands for Four Tet Live Recordings. It's not so much an alter ego, rather just a new name Kieran began using to release live recordings of some of his shows. He has released various live recordings under the name over the years, and the most recent of which came out in 2019. A year later, in 2005, he released his fourth studio LP on Domino Records called Everything Ecstatic. It was a departure from his prior albums, as it was completely void of acoustic guitar, which was a significant feature of his earlier works. While it still sounds like Four Tet, the drums were more intense and prominent in the mix than before. Kieran mentions this in an interview in 2005, saying that the album is more in line with the heavier tracks he liked to play live.
It's a bit more violent than any other record I made before. It kind of like flies all over the place, and it's probably got more in common than the sort of stuff I was doing at live shows over the last year or so, where the music has become more aggressive. And there's no like acoustic guitars or all the folksy stuff has gone completely.
Later in the year, Domino Records released a DVD version of the album that featured video clips for each track. The DVD also came with a CD with bonus material called Everything Ecstatic Part 2, which was later released as a standalone EP. In the spring of 2005, Four Tet played 2 improvisational shows in Paris and London with jazz drummer Steve Reed. He also appeared on Steve Reed's ensemble album called Spirit Walk, which was extended into a series of international tours and 2 more album releases.
It was some crazy shit.
Yeah, of course, all the time.
2005 also brought about the release of the Four Tet Remixes hip-hop album. It includes 9 Mad Villain tracks remixed by Four Tet, as well as 1 track remixed by both Four Tet and MF Doom. It stands out among other Four Tet releases as it's a full-blown display of Kieran's hip-hop influences. It isn't his most popular body of work, but it's certainly distinct, and it holds a unique space within his discography. In 2006, he released a mix album called DJ Kicks Four Tet. It's a compilation of some of Kieran's favorite songs at the time, mixed together by himself. It was an interesting body of work for Four Tet fans because it represented his musical interest and influences.
Maybe people have heard my music and like it, but don't necessarily totally know some of the stuff I'm listening to or the things I'm kind of drawing from and influenced by. So doing like a compilation album that maybe illustrates that a bit is.
2 years later, in 2008, Four Tet released the 4-track Ringer EP, which was his first major release of solo material since his 2005 album Everything Ecstatic. Ringer was a break from the norm for Four Tet, as the tracks follow a 4/4 repetitive structure that shares many overlaps with techno, which is something that he expanded on later in his career. Ringer sounds more dance-oriented than his previous works, but it certainly still has those classic Four Tet soundscapes. At the end of 2008, a new James Bond movie came out called Quantum of Solace. Four Tet had the opportunity to score the closing scene of the movie alongside David Arnold with the track Crawl and Crawl. It was a huge opportunity for Four Tet to be a part of such a high-budget blockbuster, and it proved that his work was impactful on a global scale. Now, remember how Kieran went to school with William Bevan, also known as Burial? Well, in 2009, they released a 2-track vinyl together on Kieran's label, Text Records. The 12-inch vinyl contained 2 tracks, Moth and Wolf Cub. They were only available on vinyl until 2022, when Moth hit digital streaming platforms alongside the track Nova, which is another Four Tet and Burial collab that came out in 2012. Wolf Cub, however, has yet to hit DSPs and is only officially available on the Moth/Wolf Cub vinyl, though it has been uploaded unofficially to YouTube and SoundCloud. In 2010, Four Tet released his 5th studio album titled There Is Love in You. This marked his final album release while being signed to a record label, and I'll dive into that here in just a second. While Kieran was working on the album, he was also a resident DJ at a club called Plastic People in London. He would play unfinished tracks in his sets to gauge how the audience reacted, and he would use that information to refine the tracks. The end result is a highly experimental album that is a departure from his typical style, while still somehow sounding like Four Tet. 2010 was a huge year for Kieran, and not just because of his album release. His daughter was born that year, and while he keeps his personal life extremely private, he made it known that the birth of his daughter caused him to make a large shift in his approach to his music career. Up to that point in his career, he felt overworked with interviews and PR-related things, and he didn't have as much time to make music as he would like, let alone deal with high-priority things in his personal life. After his daughter was born, he decided it was time to refocus his priorities. He said in an interview, "I've only got so much time in the day, and I don't want to be doing any nonsense if it prevents me from being with my kid." He decided to get rid of anything in his life that he considered not fun. He quit engaging with the press and record companies and decided to begin self-releasing all of his music, which is something that he had dabbled with before but hadn't fully committed to. He wanted to cut things out of his life until he had time to listen to an album every day. He said, "That gives me a sense that I've got the right balance going on. Listening to an album will do way more good than spending 2 hours sending emails to people about promos." The first release that came after making that decision was a collab with his good friends Burial and Tom York of Radiohead. The track is called Ego and was self-released on Four Tet's Text Records label.
You put out a single on your label Text Records with both Burial, who you've worked with before, but also Tom York. How did you find working with that collaboration?
It was cool, you know. It was like, I've worked on a few collaborations over the years with different people and things, and this one just came together in a nice kind of natural way. We were all something all of us wanted to do, and yeah, it was good. It was kind of, I think we didn't get together and be like, oh, let's put out like a record and like make it. We were like, let's get together and make some music and see what happens. And didn't put like pressure on to get it kind of released. Like, and then when we had something that was ready, that was worth releasing, we put it out. But it was quite, yeah, it was quite a mellow kind of like thing doing it, you know. I think it came out, and it's obviously having that combination of people was a big deal. But you can't think about that when you're making it. Like, if you worry about stuff like that when you're making music, you're gonna make something shit, I think. So.
Four Tet followed this up with another DJ mix album similar to his 2006 DJ Kicks mix album. It's called Fabric Live 59 and was Four Tet's most club-friendly body of work at the time of its release. The whole album is straight up EDM and it's heavily slanted towards UK garage. One of the tracks on the album was by an artist named Percussions, which was the first appearance of one of Kieran's new aliases, though people weren't aware of it at the time, and I'll dive deeper into that later. In 2012, Kieran released the 6th Four Tet album called Pink, and it was the first Four Tet album to be released on his own record label. Though it wasn't the typical proper Four Tet album that fans had become used to. It contained dance floor ready tracks, all driven by thick bass lines and fat 4-on-the-floor kicks. Some of the tracks have aged incredibly well, and wouldn't sound out of place in a 2023 tech house or deep house playlist. Only 1 year later, in 2013, Kieran released his 7th album called Beautiful Rewind. The album was a return to his roots, with many of the tracks being something you might put on headphones and just space out and get lost in, though it did have a few more dance-oriented tracks. The fifth track on the album, which is called Cool FM, appears in Grand Theft Auto 5 on the Worldwide FM radio station. In 2013, Kieran also unveiled 2 more aliases. The first one under the name 0011010001010100, which means 4T in binary code. He released an album called 0181 under the alias, which was a reference to a pre-2000s area code for London where he grew up. The second alias that was revealed that year was KH, which are his initials, KH, Kieran Hebden. That year he released one KH track with a self-explanatory title called The Track I've Been Playing That People Keep Asking About and that Joy used in his RA mix and Daphne played on Boiler Room. His Percussions alias made a return in 2014 with the release of a pair of split singles on Text Records, KHLHI/Sext and Aussiebot/Blatant Water Cannon. In 2015, fans got to hear 2 new album releases from Kieran, though only one of them was under the Four Tet moniker. The Four Tet album is called Morning/Evening, and it was released via Text Records on the online music store Bandcamp. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Kieran is of Indian descent via his mother's side of the family, and he had acquired a collection of Hindu devotional music from his grandfather when he was just 10 years old. He never listened to it until his maternal grandmother died when he was making Beautiful Rewind. After experimenting with the music for 3 days, he decided to create an entire album around it. The album is broken up into 2 parts, a morning side and an evening side, each with their own distinct sound. The second album he released that year was under his Percussions alias, and it was named 2011 through 2014. The album was a compilation of all previous Percussions releases, as well as other previously unreleased tracks that Kieran made between 2011 and 2014. In 2016, a few remixes of Four Tet tracks were released on Text Records, though no work of Kieran's saw the light that year, and that's because he was shaping up for a big 2017. In 2017, he released 3 singles, Planet, SW9 9SL, and Scientists. Additionally, he released his 9th studio album called New Energy, and it's personally my favorite Four Tet album. That year, he also released his 2nd ever KH track called Question. He didn't stop there though, as he felt it was time to unveil yet another alias. This time, it was a project that can be called Wingdings, referring to the text font used in the name, but it's really just a series of strange symbols. He started quietly uploading the tracks to Bandcamp, and eventually people figured out that Kieran was the one making them, as they all sound strikingly similar to Four Tet. Kieran released a total of 6 Wingdings tracks in 2017, 1 in 2018, 2 in 2019, 4 in 2020, and 1 in 2022. The 4 tracks that were released in 2020 were technically under another new alias, 000000000, which is just a bunch of zeros and O's, but from what I understand, it's lumped in under the Wingdings umbrella. In 2019, fans got new Four Tet music as well as another KH track. First up was the single called Dreamer, which was followed by a 3-track EP called Anna Painting. The KH track that was released that year is called Only Human, and at the time, it was the most popular KH track until the release of Looking at Your Pager in 2022. In March of 2020, literally right before the COVID lockdowns, Four Tet released his 10th album called 16 Oceans. It got more criticism than many of his previous albums due to the fact that some people consider it repetitive. While it's still a great album, people had come to expect every new Four Tet album to be experimental and take some risks. Some critics said that it feels like a companion to his 2017 album New Energy, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, as I consider that to be his best album. After all, when you've made 10 albums, it would be tough not to repeat yourself. Later in the year after the release of 16 Oceans, the 4T binary alias made a return since its last release 7 years prior, this time with an album called 871, which was released on Christmas Day. To fan surprise, another album called Parallels was released the very next day under the same project name. The following year, in the summer of 2021, Skrillex and Four Tet released a collab with Stara called Butterflies. Collaborating with Skrillex exposed younger fans to Four Tet's work, ultimately growing his fanbase even more. A year later, in 2022, Skrillex and Fred Again rented a house outside of London and Pangbourne to work on music together. Four Tet lived nearby, so they invited him over and he said, "I'll come over and see what happens." Skrillex said that he and Fred noticed a toothbrush hanging out of Kieran's backpack, and that was the moment that marked the birth of the self-proclaimed Pangbourne House Mafia. Not much later, Fred Again had his Boiler Room set where he played some unreleased music, one of which was the track Baby Again, which is a collab the trio made together during their time in Pangborn. With videos of the three friends hanging out circulating the internet, as well as the hype for unreleased tracks from the Boiler Room set, momentum surrounding the trio was building. In February of 2023, Skrillex's new album was set for release, and on release day, Skrillex, Four Tet, and Fred Again played a pop-up set from a school bus in the middle of Times Square to a crowd of thousands of people. The set was hectic and fun, and clips of Four Tet playing country rhythm went viral. A couple of months later, Frank Ocean dropped out of Coachella's closing slot, so the trio filled in last minute and played arguably the most iconic set of the whole festival, and Four Tet was the driving force behind all of the attention the set received. Knowing how much people on the internet loved when he played country rhythm in Times Square, he decided to play it 4 different times at Coachella, ultimately making the set go viral as people began sharing Four Tet country rhythm memes. As far as other recent Four Tet work, he released Mango Feedback and Water Synth in 2022, as well as a Nina Kraviz remix, and his most recent release was in April with the single 3 Drums. It has been 3 years since the last Four Tet album, and he has never gone more than 3 years without releasing an album, so it's very possible that we will get another one sometime in the near future. However, he's certainly a seasoned vet these days, and it's also possible that he's just at a point where he wants to slow down his output. Regardless of when the next album will be, it's incredible to see what Four Tet has accomplished over the last 3 decades. It's extremely rare for an artist to stay relevant for so long, and it's even more unlikely for an artist to be at the height of their career nearly 30 years into it. Kieran's approach to music is highly commendable because it's clear that he's never chased commercial success even though he's gotten it. He stuck to the path of making the music that he enjoys, and it just so happened that a lot of other people also enjoy it. He has collaborated with quite the random variety of artists over the years, and he has far more aliases and side projects than any other producers by a long shot. For his entire career, he led with the approach of just having fun, and he never compromised. He's still the same guy that he was during his time at the Elliott School or as a member of Fridge, and that authenticity to himself shines through his music. All of those things combined are ultimately what makes Four Tet, Four Tet.